Sure. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself first. My name is Matthew Boaz. I'm the visiting director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic at Washington and Lee School of Law in Lexington, Virginia in the US. Oh, I thought we were going in alphabetical order. Am I going first? Okay, great. I'll go ahead and get started then. I'm so sorry about that. I'll share my screen here. Great, let me get started then. So my name is Matt Boaz, as I mentioned. I'm the visiting director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic at Washington and Lee School of Law in Lexington, Virginia. Whoops, sharing, am I sharing the right?
Yes, it was the right one.
It was the right one, okay. Here we go, let's try one more time. I appreciate you all bearing with me and joining me for my presentation today, Apocalypse Often, Speculative Visions of US Immigration Policy. Before I begin, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for all of the work they've put in to make this event a success. And to quickly situate my research, I write about the abolition of immigration detention in the United States. And in doing so, I build on the work of Cesar Garcia Hernandez and other abolitionist scholars in the criminal legal context, most notably Allegra McLeod. And today I hope to explore with you all the use of apocalyptic fiction by the Trump administration in support of its harmful immigration policies, and then propose how we might rely on what are termed oppositional narratives to envision not necessarily specific policies, but a framework wherein the abolition of immigration detention is not seen as apocalyptic, but even if it is seen as apocalyptic, that the end of one system, in this case, immigration detention, might create room for something else that could be supportive, life-affirming, and not bound up in oppression. So to start, in 1971, the celebrated French author Jean Raspail found himself sitting in a cafe on the French Riviera, gazing out at the Mediterranean Sea and wondering, what if they were to come? I did not know who they were, but it seemed inevitable to me that the numberless disinherited people of the South would, like a tidal wave, set sail one day for this opulent shore, our fortunate country's wide gaping frontier. And after the publication of this novel, explaining why he wrote the book, Raspail said, the proliferation of other races dooms our race, my race, to extinction in century to come, if we hold fast to our present moral principles. The plot briefly summarized is that a large number of individuals from South Asia slowly make their way by boat around the coast of Africa and up to France, where they invade, murder, pillage, and physically take over not only France, but all of Western civilization, including the United States. The book theorizes the outnumbering of white people by immigrants, the slaughter of those who do not welcome immigrants, and the demise of European culture. It places fault on both the government, officials who are sympathetic to immigrants, and media coverage that bolsters a message of multiculturalism and fails to promote messages about the harms of migration. Obviously, this book is an apocalyptic vision of an imagined world, and albeit it's a racist, xenophobic vision, but it's a speculative vision nonetheless that I think has proved to be of great importance for reasons that I'll soon explain. The ideas espoused in this book, I argue, would ultimately lead to and build support for real concrete policies that caused enormous harm to individuals in the United States, their family members, and those who were seeking protection in the US. So you may be thinking, okay, that's a strange book. Why are we talking about this? What does it have to do with the Trump administration and their immigration policy? And I would allege a lot. During the first 3 years of the Trump administration, I was a practicing immigration attorney representing exclusively immigration detention, or people who were detained in immigration detention centers. And during that time, I witnessed firsthand the Muslim ban, its several iterations, the family separation policy at the southern border, and the effort to reduce the number of individuals who were receiving protection as refugees in the US. And during the last year of the Trump administration, I joined the academy and was suddenly given a reprieve from intense casework that had consumed my time. And I took a step back and wondered, why is all of this happening? And I discovered that it wasn't any of the prominent leadership figures, the head of the Department of Security or ICE, or any of the spokespeople who were ultimately responsible for these policies, but one person who managed to craft and direct many of these decisions. His name was Stephen Miller. So I sought out more information about him. I came across a book entitled Hate Monger by Gene Guerrero, which details his rise to power in the Trump administration. And it talks about the influence that gave substance to his policy proposals. And specifically, the first important influence was a mentor named David Horowitz, the president of a conservative think tank in the US, who noted how successfully President Obama had deployed one of the strongest weapons in politics, hope. But Horowitz believed that there was another emotional response that, when evoked, was even more powerful. And in the end, or in the lead up to the 2016 election, he argued that politicians should use fear in their messaging to voters, saying it is a much stronger and more compelling emotion than hope. It's clear to me that Miller heeded that advice because the second and related influence was this speculative fiction novel that I just shared with you, The Camp of the Saints. According to a number of emails that were released to the Southern Poverty Law Center, Stephen Miller, when he was the communication director for, at that time, Senator Jeff Sessions, who later became the Attorney General in the United States, he would frequently pitch stories to Breitbart, which is an arch-right website. And exactly 1 week later, after having an email communication, one of the editors would go on to publish a lengthy piece criticizing the Pope, the media, Western leaders, many conservatives, as being unwilling to prevent an invasion of refugees. And in the article, the author, Julia Hahn, summarizes the arguments that were put forth in the Camp of the Saints, explaining that the inability of the Western conscience to erect walls, to put her foot down, to turn people away, will lead to the undoing of Western civilization itself. So there are two possible threads of importance, I think, to draw out from this information. And the first is that perhaps the Camp of the Saints actually directly influenced US immigration policy under Stephen Miller. I've had some initial readers of the paper upon which this is built push back on that, saying that they think it might actually be more about the narrative that reinforces the fear and therefore makes these types of harmful policies possible. So while it's unclear whether broad support while it's unclear whether there was broad support for the Muslim ban, the separation of children from parents at their border, or the drastic reduction in number of refugee admissions into the US, it's quite clear that those policies were enacted purposely with real damage, both to migrants and to US families who were hoping to have their family members join them. So today I want to focus on this idea of narrative, its power, and specifically the idea of apocalypse, how it's been used, why it's effective, and how we might subvert it. I'm going to skip a few slides here and talk about this. So it might seem strange that I want to talk about apocalypse at a conference on utopias, but I have a few reasons why. First, I feel ill-equipped to speak on utopia, and indeed, I think that, especially in the United States, white guys imposing their views of perfection on the lives of marginalized populations has not turned out super well. Second, my initial instinct when confronted with the negativity of Miller's reliance on the Camp of the Saints and the provocation that was inherent in such a narrative of fear was to look for narratives of hope. Naturally, I gravitated toward the idea of utopias being the opposite of dystopias or apocalypse, but I was honestly hard-pressed to find anything that proposed such a view, which leads me to my third point, that apocalypse tends to be more interesting. Putting forth a solution, especially a perfect one, is really hard. And history demonstrates that societies typically fall apart at some point, and that the world order is constantly changing, and that stasis is less natural than growth, decline, and other cyclical norms. So in that vein, I propose a vision of what this cycle might look like in the context of immigration, particularly in the US. And to do so, I don't offer any specific policy proposals, but instead some ideas for how we might reframe our thinking, branching out beyond the political intransigence, the us versus them polarization in which many of us now find ourselves. So in order to present these frameworks, I look to opposition storytelling, which was first espoused by Richard Delgado, building on the work of Derek Bell, two notable critical race theorists in the United States. And Delgado notes the need for on-the-ground narrative, real stories from people that might counteract the prevailing beliefs in a society. And here I hope to expand the scope to include speculative fiction in our thinking about policies. So science fiction, other visions about what might happen in the future. And indeed, I think such a tact is already being used. For example, Stephen Miller relied on just such literature in crafting broad support for his policy implementations, limiting migration during the Trump administration. And herein, I think, lies the rub. From Stephen Miller's viewpoint and from the perspective of the narrator of the Camp of the Saints, abolition, or the absence of limitations on immigration and its enforcement, he views will inevitably lead to the destruction of Western civilization, what one might view as an apocalypse. But I think this promotes a fundamental misunderstanding about what abolition proposes. And indeed, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the abolitionist scholar, says, Abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And if that's the case, I think the argument here is not just about whether to ignore or denounce the narrative put forth by Miller in the Camp of the Saints, but also to think about what to put in its place. So in that vein, one way to counter the narratives of fear put forth in Camp of the Saints by Miller and his associates is to provide alternative narratives that refuse to engage with and reify the proposed ideas and instead promote other avenues of possibility. So to do so, I'll rely on the texts of three separate authors: Wabgeshag Rice, a Canadian author; Omar El-Akkad, another Canadian author who now lives in the US; and Octavia Butler, a US author. Each offers a different modality of thinking, but within the same framework of apocalyptic fiction. And the narratives offered in these texts are the following. Apocalypse is frequent and most often visited upon the historically marginalized. That nativism is a pyramid scheme. And 3, that cataclysm invites radical imagination and is an iterative process of engagement, reflection, and change. So first, in Moon of the Crusted Snow, Wabgeshag Rice instructs readers about how the apocalypse is not only impending, but that it has already occurred. The reference here is to the indigenous population within Canada, but most certainly applies to the Native American population in the US and other indigenous populations as well. And in each of these instances, the worldview under which a particular group of people was operating was shattered messily, and another was quickly and violently erected in its place. So in his novel, Rice talks about the Anishinaabe people who are indigenous members of the Ojibwe tribe in Canada, and they view an apocalyptic collapse of society as a commonplace occurrence in their tribe's history. As an elder states in the book, the world isn't ending, our world isn't ending, it already ended. It ended when the Zagnash, or the English people, came into our original home down south on the bay and took it from us. That was our world. When the Zagnash cut down all the trees and fished all the fish and forced us out of there, that's when our world ended. They made us come all the way up here, but this is not our homeland. We had to adapt, and luckily we already knew how to hunt and live on the land. We learned to live here, but then they followed us up here and started taking our children away from us. That was when our world ended again. And that wasn't the last time. Apocalypse, we've had that over and over, but we always survived. We're still here and we'll still be here, even if the power and the radios don't come back on and we never see any white people again. And part of the intractability, for example, about the conversations in the US around reparations and restitution, I think is simply about a refusal to recognize the harm, even before questions about responsibility begin. The enormity of the subject, be it multi-generational ownership of human beings, the sustained campaign of entreaties, broken treaties, and physical, legal domination of Native people in the United States, or the efforts by various countries, including France, the home country of the author of the Camp of the Saints, to both build and extend their empires at the expense of those residing in their newly claimed territories, and the harm that it has wrought are overwhelming to those who have benefited from the ending of others' worlds. One mechanism of defense is a refusal to engage. Society dares not respond to calls for redress for fear of what it might require of us, financially, emotionally, spiritually, and otherwise. Essentially, the refusal to engage is for fear that it might result in the end of one's own world as they know it, or an apocalypse. But instead of turning away from that fear, I think that speculative fiction, or this apocalyptic fiction about which I'm speaking, affords us a unique opportunity. What might it look like for an end to occur? Might we be able to imagine what we have imposed on others? And would doing so alter our thinking? For just such a vision, we can look to American War by Omar El-Akkad, which describes what a second civil war in the US might entail. A hopefully inexact, but I think clear vision of the lingering regional dynamics, injury, and resentment that can lead to large-scale conflict. El-Akkad's novel probes the depths of identity and affiliation. He considers the idea of refugee camps in the southern US, housing those who were displaced by a number of disasters. And the disintegration here comes not from external pressure, but from internal disparity, revulsion, and polarization. Harm is ongoing and frequently escalated, and the only recompense is to re-injure those who have wrought harm. But it also explores the ability of personal connections to supersede those divisions. The book also considers the role of the US internationally by inverting its power structure relative to the rest of the world. Notably here in the novel, the Middle East has banded together into a singular government known as the Boazizi Empire and serves as a place of refuge for those seeking to escape the war in the US. But importantly, this empire also acknowledges its interest in keeping the US embroiled in internal strife so that it may benefit by its relative peace and wealth. To do so, it pursues many strategies, including supplying weapons to both sides and promoting narratives that lead to continued conflict. It feels as if a mirror is being held up to oneself. The novel delves adeptly into refugee identity, and I think the most telling line in the book comes from the narrator when he discusses his own refuge in New Alaska as a relatively safe place from the violence of the subcontinental US. And he talks about his reactions as a teenager, explaining, nativism being a pyramid scheme, I found myself contemptuous of the refugees' presence in a city already overburdened. At the foot of the docks, we yelled at them to go home, even though we knew home to be a pestilence field. We carried signs calling them terrorists and criminals, and we vandalized the homes that would take them in. It made me feel good to do it. It made me feel rooted. Their unbelonging was proof of my belonging. And here, I think Ellicott seems to be saying that even in apocalyptic territory, that nativism seems to be prevalent. But in describing it as a pyramid scheme, I think he does something, which is notes how it could evolve, change, become bigger and bigger, and ultimately unsustainable, which I think is an apt metaphor as we push against the bounds of identity to which we feel rooted. But then what comes after such a demise? And for that vision, I think we look to the eminent author, Octavia Butler. This third example and final example is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. This novel offers perhaps a way forward. And of the three of the settings I've discussed, it's the most post-apocalyptic, meaning that societal changes are the least in flux. There's certainly still danger, but the foundation or the baseline is more clearly rendered here. And in her book, the protagonist, a young Black woman, envisions a new world being constructed out of the old. She interrogates whether race, class are useful markers of how communities might be built and support each other in the face of apocalypse. And in doing so, builds a semi-religious movement described in the following verses. Any change may bear seeds of benefit, seek them out. Any change may bear seeds of harm, beware. God is indefinitely malleable, God is change. All that you touch, you change, and all that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And I think that this too, religious visions can be compelling. I couldn't help but think about biblical notions of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse portrayed here on the top by the Russian painter Viktor Vesnitov, alongside the imagery of the 2 weeks ago in the US, Haitians crossing the Rio Grande only to be whipped back by Border Patrol on horseback. And such a reality is hard to imagine, and yet this is real, this happened. And so I invite us to think about along the lines of Ursula Le Guin, the renowned science fiction author, when she says that truth is a matter of imagination. And what I mean by that is best explained by Charlie Jane Anders, a trans author describing the importance of Le Guin's work in the Paris Review, saying that a huge part of the value of a science fiction story, like Le Guin's work, The Left Hand of Darkness, is that it allows you to imagine that things could be very different. And then when you come back to the real world, you bring with you the sense that we can choose our own reality and the world is ours to reshape. So I know I'm low on time here, but I just want to conclude with one minute of thoughts here, which is, whoops, sorry, I brought something into the way, okay. On March 13th, 2020, modern life was permanently altered in the United States and the world in an unexpected way. Few foresaw this specific event, and even fewer predicted the catastrophic shifts in daily life that occurred as a result of the spread of COVID-19 and international efforts to limit and prevent its spread. Certainly, enormous harm was visited upon individuals, their families, their loved ones, and even worse, disparities in these harms fell along lines of race and socioeconomic privilege that have long accounted for differences in health outcomes among various populations. But this event was indiscriminate in that, in the US at least, it consumed national policymaking and individual decision-making for over a year, and that it largely spared no one in its reach. And it was one of the first times in recent modern history when the entire population of the US was forced to confront an external threat and adjust accordingly. And I mention this not to dredge up feelings of terror, pain, or anxiety, but to acknowledge that such an event felt apocalyptic. The world as we knew it had come to an end, and there remained little clarity about what future possibilities awaited not just the US, but the larger global population. In the wake of this apocalyptic experience, many have urged a return to normal, but I think we should resist that notion and instead use this massive disruption of normal as an opportunity to think about alternative visions for the future. The tectonic rearrangements of the past demonstrate this past year demonstrate that one, we can become accustomed to massive change, and two, many things we believe to be innately fixed or required in order for society to continue to function are in fact not. And I believe that the changes and adaptations that were made over the past year demonstrate an astounding resilience. And I suggest that now is the perfect time to consider broad-scale changes to policies that were previously considered intractable. So I know that I'm out of time, so I just want to say in conclusion, it's my argument that speculative fiction was present in many of the policy decisions made by the Trump administration. We might think about how to use it in ways that could cause less harm to those who have been marginalized or otherized by past US immigration policies, and that these are voices the voices that should be brought to the forefront are those who are most affected and marginalized by these past policies. And luckily for us, there's no shortage of those visions. So thank you very much for your time. In the words of Amna Akbar, experiment, nothing is fixed, and say yes to one's imagination. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matthew. I think I'm going next, so I will go ahead and get my slides up here. So good afternoon, everyone. I come to you from Treaty 1 territory, the land of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Dene, Cree, and Oji-Cree peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I am from the US, and my area of study is the US-Mexico border, in particular the Sonoran Desert, which is the traditional territory of the Tohono O'odham peoples, the Passamaquoddy tribe, the Seri, the Gila River community, and the Kokopah. And I come to the study of utopia, somewhat like Matthew, through my love of dystopian fiction. Since I started reading The Hunger Games, my appetite for dystopian literature has grown tremendously. I see fictional dystopias as a means for political awareness. And while I was previously someone who couldn't stomach watching too much violence on TV, I now consume books which illustrate grotesque violence, kids killing kids, and other horrific human rights abuses. But it's not the illustrations of violence that I find attractive, but the way that dystopian novels show extreme power imbalances. They also honor an unlikely or unwilling or seemingly unattractive hero. And the palpable connections to the political, social, and economic realities that we are living today. Ultimately, they also show that community is required to work together. So I come to this presentation on a utopic intervention, the Migrant Trail, with keen fascination for power sharing, for an upside down way of doing life, and for studying the power of community. I set out to show how the Migrant Trail, a week-long journey of remembering in the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona and northern Mexico, recognizes and disengages from societal power dynamics, creates, honors a sustained community, generates an uncapitalist way of relating, and is evidence of a radical politics of care. This, what I'm calling an uncapitalist way of relating, is the creation of, or the recreation of care among a community. It's also the intention of walkers to honor and affirm the dignity of migrating peoples. And that's what draws me to this trail as a person and as a researcher. The contrast of how forced migrants at the US-Mexico border are seen as enemies in a 9/11 world, and/or people rendered futile by powerful economic and political divisions, is a significant distinction between utopia and dystopia that I'll examine in this presentation. Let me spend a few moments describing the political and social realities of militarization, capitalism, and migrant deaths at the US-Mexico border, so that it becomes more clear how the Migrant Trail is a utopic intervention. So as you can see in this series of slides, you see the first is a post. That's what was the original US-Mexico border. And you see new itinerations. You see 21-foot steel pieces of metal in the ground. You see low to the ground vehicle barriers that are evident on the Tohono O'odham Reservation. And you see the resiliency of people to respond to walls. Border militarization is a common reality at the border. Before Trump, throughout this era, even of Biden, right? It's something that's happening and been happening since the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. And you see various ways that militarization is used. You can see drones, you can see sensors, cameras, all kinds of ways that the US Border Patrol is responding in a militarized fashion. You don't see here pictured are the green and white vehicles, sedans, pickup trucks, ATVs that are throughout the area and very, very visible. You also perhaps don't see in this picture the tall technology towers or the attempts at virtual barriers that are also throughout the desert. The capitalist way of life is evident at the border. Goods cross freely, and the goal is economic growth without government intervention. Maquilas or foreign-owned factory plants dot the border. They thrive without the specific policies for conserving the environment, for taking care of people. Trailers haul vegetables across the border. You can see here in this picture that you have a whole bunch of trailers getting ready to cross the Mariposa port of entry, which is at one of the port of entries at Nogales. People from Mexico, United States, people from Mexico, Central and South America need the right set of documents to get into the US. Their entry is limited and policed. And yet at the border, you have unfettered policies of economic globalization, meeting rampant militarization, and strict laws to keep people from following the flow of goods. This has resulted, as we have seen for the last 25 years, in lots of migrant deaths. So this map created by Humane Borders, which is a border justice organization providing water in the desert, shows a red dot for where the remains of humans were found in the years 2000 to 2015. So these are only remains that have been found for a 15-year period that equals to almost 3,000 human lives. So how does the annual Migrant Trail, a group of 50 to 75 multi-generational and multicultural people walking from Sasa Bay, Sonora, Mexico to Tucson, Arizona over 7 days, how is the Migrant Trail intervention in violence at the border? How is the Migrant Trail a utopic intervention? I want to draw first and think about some of the conceptualizations provided about the Migrant Trail from other scholars and walkers on the trail. So scholar Abby Wheatley has written about the Migrant Trail as an autonomous political space of encounter, a place where people learn interacting with others, where they live differently in the militarized desert space, a place where migrants face trauma and death. Her characterization of the importance of the Migrant Trail as a space of encuentro in a weaponized desert, and her idea that an alternative political space is created, is integral to my understanding of the Migrant Trail. Migrant Trail organizer Kat Rodriguez speaks about bearing witness as an essential component of social change. Most recently, Magda Mankel, also another walker, organizer, and scholar, has written about the Migrant Trail as a place where participants build cultural heritage, as a community that's figuring out how to relate to migrants, how to think about their privilege, how to honor the dead, and attest to the tragedy of global migration at the border. Mankel writes about how the framing of the Migrant Trail in positive human rights discourse humanizes people who have died in the desert. The Migrant Trail vision provided at the bottom of this slide also shows how the trail is conceptualized and seeks to humanize those who are seen as useless, as enemy, or as other. Now let me conceptualize kind of the political nature of the Migrant Trail. I start with the assertion, not provided on your slide here, that Sansi says that walking can be a political act. Walking gets you familiar with the environment. It makes the personal more important. And it goes against capitalist norms of getting to a place in the most efficient way. Walking in the desert is a political act where they're recreating and expanding community practices, a community or a politics of care. To unearth some aspects of a politics of care, I draw on the work of feminist scholars who talk about how care happens in relationships. Eva Federer-Kate invites a consideration of power in the significant relationships between carer and cared for. She talks about being temporarily abled as a condition that we all experience in life. She also reminds us that we are dependent on others for our own well-being. Nikki Ward argues that we need to understand our identity and human connections to develop an understanding of care. She highlights intersectionality that can help us understand different experiences with care that's dependent on our identities. And then Ward and Solomon, pictured here on the slide, talk about how acts of caring happen because we understand and we engage with others. They say that caring is contextual, that it's not general and impersonal, but specific. Woodley, in describing a radical politics of care, talks about care as a way of relating in a community that's governed by a set of policies. And Christopher Hall Harris, also found in Woodley et al., communicates that, quote, care cannot be built on sentiment, but must be invested in unsettling and undoing totalizing systems of knowledge that socially construct, politically maintain, and theoretically justify the suffering of others. On the trail, we care for each other. We practice a politics of care, so to speak. During regular breaks, participants ask others how they're doing, what they need, how their feet are feeling. Participants are grouped into teams to make the walking and resting regular and possible. One team puts up potty tents and scoops their excrement into the earth, not pictured. Other teams organize snacks, and the medical team bandages blisters. We also have solidarity groups of churches and other border justice organizations that bring us meals in the desert, as evidenced in two of the pictures here. Like Kate, many of us walkers recognize our temporary abledness, and we ride in a sag wagon to take the strain off our bodies at different points of the walk. And while being dependent on one another is not something that always feels good, especially in a capitalist society that values strong and independent persons, we know that we cannot physically carry enough water or survive on our own in the desert. I recall one personal experience where I realized that acting on my own was simply not smart. I was trying to fold the potty tent by myself, even when another person had offered to help, when a jumping choya got affixed to my hand. I cried aloud, and thankfully a couple different walkers responded. One came over with a pair of tweezers and began taking out each individual sticker. Then Dr. Marlowe, an 80-year-old retired physician and probably the oldest walker to have completed the walk in recent years, arrived with his handy blue pick to take off all of the stickers at once. It was a minor kind of a thing, and yet it hurt. And I was glad to have people respond. I was glad to receive the caring work or the caring response of people around me. On the Migrant Trail, we engage in many different acts of caring, a type of care that humanizes. Many of us carry crosses bearing the names of a person who lost their life in the desert, or as Wheatley explains, someone who is killed by the weaponized desert. We also carry crosses with the words of unknown, or desconocido a, which signify that not even the sex of the person was known, just part of their remains were recovered. We honor and practice, we honor the dead by practicing a Latin American ritual of presente, calling out the names on the crosses and inviting them to walk with us by responding with presente. We walk to remember, we walk to humanize, we walk to connect. So the pictures offered in this slide show us at the beginning of our walk from Sasabe, Sonora, which is our 1 mile journey from 1 mile south of the border up to the US-Mexico border. We symbolically carry the coffins of men, women, and children who have died in the desert. We walk in a single file long line to, or double file in this case, to bring awareness to the people who have died. And you can see the first walker carries a, well, I'll show it better in this next picture, prayer ties. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a person with a set of prayer ties lifted up high. This is another way that another way of remembering. The prayer ties are carefully created by an Indigenous elder. They put each year medicine in small packets to recognize those who have died or been found in the Sonoran Desert for that fiscal year. So we carry crosses, we engage in different kinds of remembering activities, such as the blessing that's being offered on the top left-hand corner. And at the end, the ritual that we do is having our feet washed. A few of us are lucky to receive that blessing, and it's in deep contrast to the welcome that migrants receive as they come into town. We also bear witness, and the words listed below are part of the Migrant Trail vision of why we bear witness. So one of the pictures shows us at the end with a press conference, speaking our truths about our experience. We also have different interactions with Border Patrol depending on the year. Sometimes we watch to make sure that the Border Patrol is acting humanely. Sometimes we get flyovers by Border Patrol. And so we bear witness to the fear that others experience by perhaps experiencing very, very tiny portion of that fear. The Migrant Trail is not intended to replicate the migrant experience. It's intended as an opportunity to walk, to bear witness to the realities and to the deaths in that region. In the face of capitalism, which sees humans as workers, where we remember those who have died and bear witness to the tragedy of death, recognizing the humanity of others, we are engaging in anti-capitalist behavior. And while I could probably talk about the Migrant Trail for many hours, I will begin to conclude this presentation. During the Migrant Trail, participants from Canada, the US, Mexico, and a few other countries meet to walk in solidarity, to remember those who have died and are dying in the militarized borderlands. In the week of walking, participants care for each other, not using money as a means of support, but by asking questions about their well-being, delivering snacks, walking together, and relating in ways not intended to enrich any one person or group. Tasks are shared across the community. Thus, I return to the question of the Migrant Trail as a utopic intervention and wonder what could happen if we were to take some lessons from the Migrant Trail in terms of care and apply them to the realities of the border. What if our policies at the border were formed by an idea of care? What if we asked people how they were doing and we bandaged them instead of arrested them? What if people knew where they were going and didn't encounter people that were going to do them harm, like Border Patrol or like gangs? What if the role of the Border Patrol was different? What if people had access to food, water, and medical care? And ultimately, what if a militarized border did not exist? Is that a question we can ask today? I'm hopeful that this presentation invites further reflection about how policies intended to respond to forced migrants could be shaped differently and create positive social change. Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Barbara Franz, and I want to thank the conference organizers for making this possible. And I want to talk with you today about the post-pandemic future of US refugee resettlement and of the US refugee resettlement programs. Within the framework of this conference, I think I would label it a selective dystopia for some. The focus of my presentation will be on how local activists attempt to help overcome it. The United States, of course, through COVID and through Trump, has escalated anti-immigration policies. Oops. Sorry. These deterrence-focused policies included, but are not limited to, family separation. You've probably seen the photos of children in cages, the narrowing of eligibility grounds for asylum. Attorney General Jeff Sessions stopped asylum for people who have experienced gang violence or family violence, restricted number of asylum seekers allowed into ports of entry each day. This has been known as metering. Asylum cooperation agreements with Guatemala, Honduras, and Salvador. These resemble the so-called safe third country agreements in Europe and elsewhere. The migrant protection protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy, which allowed US border officials to return non-Mexican asylum seekers to Mexico, and the use of Title 42 of a previously obscure 1933, I believe, public health order instituted by the Trump administration around the start of the pandemic, which expels most migrants to Mexico and led to the de facto suspension of the fundamental right to seek asylum in this country. Title 42 has been continued under President Biden. The Trump administration also dismantled the American Refugee Resettlement Program and severely obstructed access to US territory for so-called undesirable immigrants, immigrants specifically originating, for example, from predominantly Muslim countries. The most obvious sign of the demolishment was the lowering of the annual caps from 45,000 to 15,000 within 4 years. In each of these years, though, the number of refugees actually arriving in the United States was lower than the cap. For example, in the fiscal year 2020, only 11,814 refugees were actually resettled in the US, according to the Refugee Processing Center. So the radical decline in the number of incoming refugees, of course, also had devastating impact on the refugee resettlement agencies, which had to let go many of their employees. Catholic Charities, for example, closed 22 offices. Here's a photo of Melania Trump on her way to see caged children separated from their families. The infamous jacket she's wearing says, "I really don't care, do you?" So in the tri-state area, this is the area encompassing New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. Groups of citizens, migrants, resettled refugees, and asylees responded with grassroots mobilization of volunteers and donors to these unique challenges posed by the Trump administration's elimination of these programs. The COVID-19 pandemic as a second moment of rapture was, in addition to Trump's election in 2016, also a point of citizen mobilization. Methodologically, this paper is based on participatory observation, as well as 8 semi-structured qualitative interviews conducted on Zoom with activists who are involved in the 4 organizations that I want to discuss, an interview with a refugee activist, as well as the in-depth study of the 4 projects that in many ways I feel represent the ingenuity and the work of these NGOs, particularly during the COVID-19 crises. Due to the limitations, I will be mostly summarizing the results of these interviews, but my written paper has many quotations. I've used the works of these authors shown on the slide in order to define resistance in my paper. So the 4 grassroots projects that I want to focus on emphasize, I think, civic activism based on reflective solidarity and resistance work that kind of quintessentially seeks to combat othering and exclusion. The projects are housed in nonprofit organizations that have fundamentally a very different version of American citizenship and the American society than the Trump administration had with Making America Great Again. Citizens and non-citizen activists in all four of these NGOs resisted the Trump administration with the efforts to aid refugees, to aid asylum seekers, and to aid undocumented migrants, many of whom were, of course, in dire need of help, especially during the pandemic. Here's a quotation by Dina Rose. It's a good example for a typical path to activism and resistance, but I'm not going to focus on this because of time reasons. I would like to talk a little bit about the Lighthouse, which is a cooperative project that really started in April 2021. First, Friends of New York and New Jersey, which provides advocacy, visitation, and resettlement assistance for detained asylum seekers and refugees, in partnership with a number of other humanitarian NGOs and progressive churches, opened the new Lighthouse in Union City, New Jersey this summer. It is the second time that a group of local NGOs established a home for people seeking refuge who have been released from detention. So this is a 6-bedroom, 3-bath building that can house up to 12 people. The Lighthouse is a very good representation for resistance. For example, right now a Guatemalan family is residing in the Lighthouse, and this Guatemalan family had spent the last year and a half detained at the Mexican border. So the Lighthouse illustrates a successful local resistance attempt, I think, against the Remain in Mexico policy and Title 42. The Lighthouse also represents physical evidence of successful cooperation of local organizations and groups that result in tangible improvements to the lives of refugees and asylum seekers while resisting xenophobic policies. Setups like the Lighthouse allow also its residents to settle down, to connect with community, and to begin rebuild their lives. A number of grassroots organizations raised funds for COVID-19 relief. Between March and July 2020, one of these organizations, Hearts and Homes, used relief funds to assist 130 families made up of 414 people. They basically help put food on the table, buy medicine, pay utilities, and pay rent. The one grassroots project that made the national news was the mask making initiative. Neighbors for Refugees encouraged 7 refugee women from Afghanistan and from Syria who owned sewing machines to begin a mask sewing project for underprivileged populations, for example, prison populations and school children. The refugee women joined a collective of 250 volunteers. And for these women, the mask making project itself gave them an opportunity to connect with the new community by helping people in the new community and by helping them fight the pandemic, as well as it gave them also a way to help their family make ends meet. So this is a photo of Shamira Azizi, one of the Afghani refugee women who partakes in the Neighbors for Refugees mask making program. And finally, the Fun Club. These are pictures of the Fun Club, how it looked before the pandemic made it go virtual, of course. The Fun Club is another such project that was initiated by Welcome Home Jersey City in 2017. In contrast to the fundraising and aiding people in need elsewhere, this program is based on weekly physical get-togethers. The Fun Club is a family program that provides weekly meals with local residents, as well as academic coaching, homework help, and ESL classes for grown-ups. The pandemic made it difficult to continue with the Fun Club as a live event, but the Fun Club very quickly also became a remote event. So the existence of these often mundane activities not only aided the refugees, it also linked them to their citizen neighbors. And the activities by volunteers integrated into their social lives can be understood as everyday resistance. And I think they might be more common than we assume. Grassroots NGOs work became particularly important, of course, during the pandemic, when organizations like Welcome Home broadened their mandate by including all people who asked for help, incorporating undocumented immigrants who did not receive any COVID relief stimulus money, and homeless people into their client base. I use Johansson and Windhagen's definition of everyday resistance as a practice. It's routine work that is not politically articulated or formally organized, and it is work that avoids sometimes to be detected as resistance, or it is not recognized as resistance. Solidarity resistance is a resistance that can be seen as an act performed on behalf of or in solidarity with someone in a subaltern position and in response to power. This is what Boaz and colleagues call solidarity resistance. So the 4 programs that I discussed were created by citizen activists who strongly opposed the Trump era restrictions, which includes mass detention and the public charge rule. These activists worked to help those who were disadvantaged due to federal policies and other circumstances. Thus, with their action, they practiced resistance. The practice of volunteering frequently goes hand in hand with the qualitative shift in the individual's understanding of her day-to-day experience, because it often creates solidarity with others. Volunteering often leads to personal relationships. So on the other hand, the refugee family became friends with the volunteering citizens, right? This is the beginning of the path to inclusion, but it requires adjustments, both on the side of the refugee and on the side of the citizens. So their relationship needs to go through what Jodi Dean has called affective solidarity, which is based on emotions, and what she has called conventional solidarity, which is based on common interest. For Jodi Dean has called reflective solidarity, the mutual expectation of a responsible orientation towards relationship. So this awareness contributes to a civil society because it combats othering and exclusion. Framing resistance under the banner of reflective solidarity with others provides us with a broader structure of understanding that might allow us to create the future where the needs of newcomers can be met, and at the same time, their presence can reinvigorate shared commitment to political values. So I want to direct your attention very specifically, quickly here to Priti's last comments about her personal involvement and the solidarity that she has been developing and how this has changed her life. She says, so yes, I'm much happier being involved. I think that I did channel some of my angst about the 2016 election and the state of our country into a more positive, productive kind of way. Being involved in so the Welcome Home Jersey City has made me feel so American, and I'm so positive about this country. In conclusion, I have 3 very quick recommendations for the State Department. The bottom-up work that occurred during the Trump administration and during the pandemic, and that has continued into the Biden administration, provides additional mechanisms and programs to the now revived refugee resettlement program. Many citizen activists and volunteers who have taken on roles in these NGOs see themselves as playing a quintessential part in the future of refugee resettlement in the United States. The NGO work discussed here is continuing, and if supported, it could result in a more grounded, inclusive resettlement experience for the newly arriving refugees. Currently, refugees in the United States receive 90 days of support by refugee resettlement agencies, by the federal agencies. Of course, this is not enough. Therefore, I recommend that the State Department includes this kind of NGO work within the refugee resettlement program. This will make the program a much more robust and functional tool for the refugees' acculturation in their local communities. So what I'm advocating here is a more fleshed out version of the public-private partnership that we see in Canada. That's my utopia for the United States. In addition, the organizing power of the wealthy middle class cannot be underestimated. For example, Westchester County in New York frequently ranks among the 10 richest counties in the United States. So in the future, progressive groups could work more closely with these groups like Hearts and Homes or Neighbors for Refugees to help influence the mainstream Democratic parties on issues where their interests overlap, for example, the Dreamers, or to push the current administration to end Title 42 expulsions. And finally, in terms of future research, the concepts of everyday resistance and reflective solidarity need more analysis, but should be included in the theorizing surrounding the conceptualization of inclusive citizenship and the position of the citizen, the asylee, the refugee, the migrant as an agent of relevance vis-a-vis the state. I look forward to the discussion and I welcome hearing your comments and questions. You can reach me also at the email address below. Thank you. Oops.
Thank you, Barbara, and great sticking to time. I am going to try to share screen. I'm on a backup laptop, so but I need to be made a host again, please. I sent a message in the chat, but I don't know if you got it. Grace or Clarice?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you make me a host again so that I can share my screen?
Sure. Wait a minute.
I was a host, but the privileges were removed.
Oh, wait. Done.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. Can everybody see okay? Just get a thumbs up. I'm going to assume everything is fine. So I'm just going to present a little bit of my project on what I see as the pinkwashing of the U.S. immigration detention system through the implementation of selective reforms, which are referred to as pods and siphon out trans detainees for special treatment. So you may be wondering what pinkwashing is. It's a term from the international relations literature, and it basically refers to the co-optation of gay justice movements through neoliberalism. So it kind of connects a little bit earlier to what Jodi was talking about on the Migrant Trail. The paradigmatic case is the Israeli case of hosting a very large pride parade in Tel Aviv while also engaging in apartheid against the Palestinians. So basically, it's a state attempt to distract or move attention away from imperialism, colonialism, and gross violations of human rights through saying we can't possibly be bad because we are pro-LGBT. So it kind of goes along with like greenwashing and other terms that have come to describe what are seen as cynical state ploys. So I don't think I need to talk too much about US detention with this crowd, but the main point is that we have to remember that detention is administrative and there are no time limits in the US, and it is almost always the site of trauma and abuse, physical, sexual, and verbal abuse by officers, and that these feelings of stigma and state violence and brutalization and injustice continue long after even short periods of detention. So I'm focusing on queer immigrants. So the reason is because I think the scholarship is pretty conclusive now that heterosexuality is a baseline function in migration and refugee law. The refugee definition has sort of an animating principle of a male, straight political prisoner fleeing with his family. And that family is usually the heteronormative one. But yet we see that gender and sexuality influence all stages of the migration process. So of course, the decision to migrate away from queer unfriendly countries throughout the immigration process, and then the settlement trajectories. And it's clear that queer people, specifically trans people, continue to face discrimination after arrival in the United States. The picture you're looking at is a piece of art by Julio Salgado called I Am a Butterfly. And so queer immigrants become queer prisoners. They are particularly vulnerable to profiling and anti-immigrant basis because they come more into contact with the criminal justice system. And I think earlier Matthew was indicating the dense links between the immigration and the criminal justice systems. But we know that prison staff and healthcare professionals are grossly undertrained on how to support trans people, how to approach and even speak to people properly, let alone administer healthcare. And we see this as well with guards and staff policing access to medical care and sort of deciding when to give hormone treatment and when to withhold it. We also know that when ICE guards are worried about mistreatment of trans, the knee-jerk or quick solution is to put them in solitary confinement, which is defined as torture. So there's a wealth of literature on the abuse of transgender detainees in detention centers and in prisons. Importantly, this is just like a tiny fraction of the population. It's estimated about 1 in 500, and these are people who self-identify. So the population is probably slightly larger, but even then we're talking about like a very small group. And yet 1/4 of the substantiated incidents of sexual abuse involve a transgender detainee. And this ranges, but we also have continuing relentless reports of misgendering, marginalizing, using epithets, name calling. The abuse just goes on. They were also often held longer. Trans women in the fiscal year 2017 were held almost twice as long as the average detainee. So in 2008 and 2011, you may remember that the Obama administration put forward these new performance-based national detention standards. These are voluntary guidelines to try to bring the treatment of people inside prisons up to some sort of better or morally acceptable level. There was a specific recommendation in 2009 to help special populations to receive better treatment, and this included vulnerable individuals. There was the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which came to DHS in March 2013, for which DHS asked all ICE employees to attend exactly one training lasting about 1 hour to understand PREA standards. You may also recall Obama's Felons Not Family address, and then the resulting prioritization enforcement policy, or PEP. This was to target people with criminal convictions as opposed to families. And this was unacceptable to a lot of trans people and their allies because, again, trans people are more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. Therefore, this policy kind of comes into conflict or directly rebukes the earlier recommendations to better treat vulnerable populations. So in May 2015, after protests, the Obama administration puts out a new care memo on how to, again, better address the placement and care of transgender and other vulnerable detainees. So what are the pods? The pods in 2011, the first pod opened. It was 64 beds within the Santa Ana jail, specifically for trans detainees. It was shut down through mass mobilization of the trans and queer community, and then resulting in a hunger strike in 2017. Here you see activists outside the prison. In 2015, after shutting down Santa Ana, they opened a new pod at Prairie Land Detention Center, which is 40 miles outside of Dallas. And this was subcontracted to a private firm, the Emerald Correctional Management LLC. under the bed mandate or the bed quota, which I'm sure this audience is familiar with, but otherwise we can discuss it further. Pearland was not super successful. No one wanted to go there. It was very far away. It was very bleak. So they started doing reports, and they found out that there were the abuse that the trans detainees had been reporting in the mainstream ICE facilities was continuing at the pods. People did not want to be transferred to rural Texas or California. They were actually misgendering themselves to avoid these transfers. The transfers were also seen as traumatizing, as they were often transferred wearing handcuffs. As well, every time someone leaves and then re-enters a detention center or a prison, they are subject to full body and cavity searches, which you could imagine would be especially traumatizing for trans people. Including in the transfer was a policy to segregate detainees in solitary confinement, again, for their own protection. And unfortunately, the staff at these centers were grossly undertrained, and so the misgendering and homophobia continued at the pods, which were set up by the administration to be some sort of caring site. You may remember when Geneset Gutierrez interrupted Obama's Pride Month speech. So she was actually protesting these pods. She was protesting the detention and calling for the release of all detainees, not the creation of far-flung detention centers. She was booed and escorted out of the press conference during Pride Month. You may also remember the tragic death of Roxana Hernandez. She was being held in a pod in the Cibola Center in New Mexico, which is near but not inside Albuquerque, which was run by the private firm CoreCivic. I don't know exactly why, but it was abruptly shut down in January 2020. So if anybody knows why, I'd be very interested. But there's a wrongful death suit being filed on her behalf right now. So in May 2019, ICE decided to open the doors to the Cibola Center and offered select media a press tour of the pod. Here you see trans people doing, a very stereotypical effeminate things, and also reading books, but no one is protesting, and everybody is asked to smile and play games. So my argument is that vulnerability is a dialectical category, that these pods show us that no one is inherently vulnerable, but it's the structural factors of society that create conditions or obstacles that make people vulnerable. So just because you're a trans person, it doesn't mean you're any more vulnerable de jure. It's just the de facto conditions that make you vulnerable. So under training of guards, under or policing of your medication. And more importantly, and we understand this from the intersectional literature, is that by siphoning out trans people as vulnerable and then addressing that vulnerability as a problem, the administration is able to sidestep the larger problems with the detention centers by focusing on this one. And again, I'm talked about how small a minority it is, this one minoritized identity without having to contest the idea of detention. And importantly, that trans people are more likely to suffer under criminalization, and the pods do nothing to address this problem. So a lot of trans people in detention are raced and classed as well. And there's a lot of criminalizing of crimes of poverty in the United States. And so this makes the layering of violence, homelessness, and poverty that bring trans and gender non-conforming people to the attention of the government to begin with is another way that the PEP and other policies clash with the so-called CARE memo. Here you see a poster from a protest to close the detention center, and again featuring Geneset, who had interrupted the press conference. So I argue that the pods are pinkwashing detention. I argue that by siphoning out and pointing to the pods as a reform, that the Obama administration in particular, but it was also, as you saw from the chronology, taken up by the Trump administration, is actually trying to normalize the vast majority of detention and sidestep questions of harm. The trans community and their allies have been calling for the end of all detention, and yet this proposal shows that trans people deserve better detention, but not freedom. So by showing that trans people can access a hair salon, then we see that trans people can have conditions that are not available to the regular population, but they still somehow don't deserve their freedom. And then finally, I think that PODs pinkwash detention because it's able to sidestep the naming of detention as a justice issue. So by talking about detention as a question of care or better conditions, but not liberation, we no longer talk specifically about the end of detention for justice, but rather bettering detention. So in this way, the PODs proposal is an example of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls a reformist reform. So a reform that actually sets back the struggle and interrupts the quest for liberation. So thank you very much. And I appreciate your attention and bearing with me during my computer troubles. So I will invite the speakers to, if they can, turn their cameras on. I have a number of questions, but maybe we can start by having questions for each other as well. If any of the presenters had a question for someone else, it would be your chance to talk now. I invite you to turn off your mic, to turn on your mic.
I don't necessarily have a question, but I think it's interesting some of the strands of connection between all of our presentations and the different kinds of ways that solidarity is happening and the ways that people are responding. Yeah, I find that fascinating. So thanks to all of you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Jodi. So I have some questions. Jodi, I was wondering how long you were on the trail for, and if it was during COVID, and if you've been more than once, if COVID has impacted how people can care for each other because of proximity and the contact that's sort of needed, especially in like the washing of the feet and these very like important symbolic and intimate acts, which really bring people together. I'll just put out all my questions maybe, and then in the interest of time. For Barbara, I really love the idea of the fun club. I'd never just like heard of that before, but just like the creating of fun just sounds like so needed. And I wonder, this might sound a bit oblique, but do you see like, I don't know if you're into this like fun versus joy literature at all, but if you see like fun and joy and the roles they play in solidarity networks, like if you could expand a little bit on that, because as someone who I am doing a private sponsorship right now, a group of 5 is what is called in Canada, and I find it hard to bring fun into as an obligation that's individualized. So it's almost as though like with the group, you can see how like the group, when it's in an NGO, can sort of take collective responsibility for creating fun, but then how do you sort of like create the fun without it becoming heavy and an obligation, which as far as I understand is sort of this difference between fun and joy. And Matthew, I'm so sorry, but my computer totally died during your presentation. So if there's anything that you wanted to just comment or expand upon that you didn't have a chance to, I really invite you to do that now. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question, Stephanie. Yeah, I've been participating in the Migrant Trail since 2006. So the Migrant Trail has been going on since 2004. I joined a couple of years later and walked continuously for 10 years. And then since my son was born, it's been more challenging to get there. The last 2 years during COVID have been virtual walks. So still the organizing committee has met and figured out a way to provide some reflection with participants. And so the first year, I think it was more challenging to care for one another because Zoom webinars don't give you the opportunity to interact so much. So this past year, they, because I wasn't part of the organizing committee this year, really worked ways so they can build community. And so had kind of team meetings every day and times for reflection. And the virtual walk was a series of reflections and then encouraged people to walk each day. And then there was a speaker at night. And then the Migrant Trail changed also to become something that was generating funds for other organizations doing border justice work. In the last few years, it's changed to respond to care in different kinds of ways. But I would say that it's been true to its kind of way of caring and doing things in a different way. So thanks for your questions. Those are my responses.
Hey, so thank you for the question, Stephanie. The Fun Club is the name of the club that was given to the club by Welcome Home Jersey City, by that organization. So I do not know whether they had big philosophical debates about fun or joy in the background. I don't know. It is, however, in non-COVID times, they're getting together on every Thursday of, a bunch of volunteers and citizen activists with whoever wants to come from the immigrant slash asylee slash refugee community. It's wide open for all of those. The people that have cars drive each other. I mean, they drive the non because usually a refugee doesn't necessarily have a driver's license. And I think there's also an exchange of who is cooking. It's organized. Often it's the refugees that provide the food. Often it's the immigrants that provide the food. Sometimes I guess it's also the the locals that do provide the food, but every time I went, it was always very fabulous dishes. And I think the fun comes in by sitting together and communicating with each other on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, there are also games for the children. There is tutoring available, and other kinds of services as well during that time. While they were online, I wasn't doing that much because whatever, but they did stuff like bingo. They played they played bingo online. It's really, I think, an incredible opportunity to get to know each other in an environment that is not semi-professional or professional, and that allows for friendships to develop. Does that help you a little bit with answering?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I was more trying to connect it to your recommendation to try to emulate the Canadian model. And I just, so I just wonder, like, if you can imagine that, like, if you could, like, if you see those two kind of connecting, that finding that this fun club, all these wonderful ways it creates bonds, but then also if you do want this sort of PPP model, how you would, if you see that kind of coming together in some way.
I'm not going to make any kind of suggestion regarding how I can see the two policies merge or even be turned into something that you guys have. I think it would be one step into the right direction if the federal government would start acknowledging the work that these groups are doing and maybe helping out every once in a while with a grant, because at this point it's all privately funded. And that would be already a great achievement for where we're at right now. Realistically, I mean, I know we're talking about utopias, but realistically, I think it would be great.
You can cover the cost of food, right? Have you heard of Newcomer Kitchen?
No.
Oh, it's great. So it's in Toronto, and it was something like a cooking club, which is now a business. You can order dinners, and it's all women, most of whom are not English or French speaking, and some of whom are illiterate. But someone has given over the space, and they've made a website, and they always sell out. Like, I never order in time. So yeah, I mean, there's just all these great kind of models, I guess, you know, and it's not like necessarily bad to devolve from the state, right? And to try to, yeah.
It's a good idea, actually, no convocation.
Yeah. They were doing cooking classes, but that had to stop during COVID. And the good thing about the cooking classes is the skills transfer, and the people are seeing the validation of the cooking women, right? Like, because I can't do what they can do, right? So, you know, that kind of, you know, the exchange of, someone talked about this a little bit in the presentations, like when you can see the other and then you can see the vulnerabilities and the strength. Matthew, did you want to?
Yeah, I was gonna say, actually, Barbara, I worked in New Jersey, and First Friends supported a lot of our clients.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
they do a lot of amazing work. So when you talked about them, I was like, oh yeah, that's. I mean, there's so much. I think, you know, as a practicing attorney, we get hung up on, my goal is to get this person out of detention, and then it's sort of like on to the next person, and there's all of this other support that's needed. And I mean, for those of you who study immigration detention centers in the US, right, when somebody's released from detention, typically they literally open the door, and when people are out in these rural places, it's, you know, horrifying. And even in New Jersey, where it's not necessarily rural, but where our detention facility was in the middle of a bunch of warehouses in an industrial district. So I can't say enough good things about them, and it's so wonderful that you're acknowledging and thinking about their work, and I'm glad to hear about the Lighthouse project. The one thing that I wanted to loop in was to talk about immigration detention and abolition, how that fits together. But Stephanie, I had seen that you are writing on this and have written about this. And then there was a presenter yesterday, Sherry Aiken, maybe, who talked about your work, and I think, you know, pushing this reformist view in reformist reforms versus abolition steps. And I really like that comparison. And that was one of the points that I'd hoped to make if I had had more time, was this idea that immigration detention being sort of like this cyclical thing, or trying to imagine something when it's hard, or it's hard to imagine those things when we're in this present time, and have been in this time for a long time. But, you know, in the 1950s, essentially there was a handful of people in immigration detention in the US. So it was almost non-existent. And even as recent as the 1990s, you know, the numbers were much closer to like Canada's numbers, which I saw yesterday were 8,000 people over the course of a year, maybe 300 people at a time.
It's pre-COVID. Right now they're very low. They're down to about 1,000, maybe less.
Yeah, and sort of thinking about, you know, versus the US, where the high point, you know, was 55,000 at a time, or hundreds of thousands of people over the course of a year. And even during COVID was down to 15,000. And that seemed like a huge victory. But yeah, just trying to imagine this as not only something that is possible, but something that has existed before, and in a world that has been the reality before. So I just wanted to acknowledge that work.
Yeah, that's an argument that I often use, right? Because people are like, well, what would this even look like? And I'm like, well, this is what it was. Like, people just announced themselves, they got a court date, and they came back because their interest is in compliance. It's not in living underground and living in fear. So,
right.
And this is why I worry about alternatives like the pods. I also have an article under review right now about e-carceration in the detention system, where one of my findings is that the introduction of e-carceration has grown the number of people who are subject to immigration detention control. So if alternatives are supposed to reduce it, which is one of the, because I also work at the International Detention Coalition, and that's what we're trying to do, is use alternatives to reduce detention, but the actual numbers of people in the web, especially in the US, are just getting bigger the more alternatives are introduced.
Right. I think that framing is really important, right? Because here a lot of scholars or policy makers refer to it as alternatives to detention, right? But in fact, it's not, you're under surveillance, you're subject to being called in at any point and your life being disrupted. So that's a really, e-carceration, it's a really interesting formulation.
I mean, so we had a case in Canada of the security certificate detainees, and there were like 5 guys who had secret evidence against them, and they were in prison for many years, and then they were let out. And then, Grace, you can stop recording whenever, we're just chatting. Or at the end of the session. And then they got let out, and 2 of them, I think, wanted to go back to prison because the incarceration at home, and this was before